important. It's the ethics behind algorithmic decision making, and Jennifer Boon is our speaker. Please go ahead.
Hi. So I'm going to open my presentation by explaining a little about the organisation that I come from and who I am. So we're very new. I generally make the assumption that people haven't heard of us, so apologies if you have, but I'm just going to give a little bit of background. And then I'm going to talk through some of the processes that we go through in assessing the ethical decision making behind using algorithms in the real world. And I'll finish off with a short piece on what we're actually doing at the centre. I appreciate that's not the bulk of what you're here for, but I always like to have a bit of an opportunity to talk about our work. So the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation has been established by government to give independent advice back to government, which I appreciate from the outside can seem like a pretty small distinction. Currently we are being, I guess you would describe it as being incubated within government with a view to becoming a formally independent body, and that's important because it gives us a capacity to give challenging and difficult messages to government who are then required to respond to us. So rather than being a kind of internal political body, the idea is that we really are an independent voice. We are still going through that process. We're pretty new. We were set up last autumn. Yeah, we are, I think we're kind of the first kind of body of our kind in the world. These are not issues that are only being debated in the UK, so lots of governments are active and interested, but this particular approach is one that the UK has gone with. I think it's useful to draw attention to our name. It's not the slickest, but it does draw out the fact that although we're very interested in ethics and the limits of what's right and wrong in these technologies, we are a kind of pro-tech group. Our sense is that these technologies are coming and we need to think about how we can use them best for society. This is just a brief timeline of where we've come from. I won't talk you through the full detail, but I think it's worth saying that for a few years, quite a lot of the policy groups in this space have been saying that there's a need for a centre of our kind. That was then taken on as a government commitment. We formally came into being sort of between the summer and the autumn of last year. We have an independent chair, which means we're not managed through ministerial or government lines. And we've actually started doing some work since around October. So pretty new, but we're starting to get on our feet. And the two major pieces that we're doing and planning to produce are, we're referring to as our reviews. And one is on bias in algorithmic decision making, and the other is on targeting of online content. Both really important areas, both fraught with ethical questions. My specialism is on the algorithmic decision making side, so I will focus on that, but if anyone has any questions on the sort of broader remit of their work, I'm happy to try and field them as best I can. And then I have a quote here from our Secretary of State, and I think it's interesting to put in context of the way the UK government perceives these kind of issues and these questions, that I think there's a sense that these technologies are coming out globally, and from a governmental perspective there's a desire to compete, there's a desire for the UK to be a leader, and there are ways in which we can do that and there are ways in which we can't. So we're a more heavily regulated space than you would see than say in somewhere like America. We're certainly a more regulated space than you might see in somewhere like China, and so we can't necessarily move as rapidly as we might in some of those technologies. But what we can do is have some of the best conversations in the world with our society and think in the greatest depth about where the benefits and where the costs of these technologies come from. And the idea that doing that and doing that well brings with it a kind of competitive advantage, I think is at the core of government policy in this area, and that's what we're keen to facilitate. In terms of my specific job, as I say, I primarily work on algorithmic decision making. I specifically specialize in bias, but I'm not going to focus on that to the exclusion of all else today. So I guess before I go into the meat of my presentation, the title begs two obvious questions. So the first is, what do we mean by algorithmic decision making? And I think something that I'm talking about quite a lot at the moment is that there's a tendency, I think, in government and in policy in general to talk about algorithmic decision making like it's a radically new technology. Of course it's not. At its heart, all it really means is making patterns or ruled-based choices, which has been something that has been around for centuries, especially in some of the more numerate sectors that I deal with. So in finance, for example, actuarial science is nothing new. And I think that's kind of an important context for us to remember. Also, when you stretch algorithmic decision making to that definition, it is enormous. It's sort of everywhere. So in anywhere that you're making some kind of structured decision, especially if you're bringing in any kind of risk scoring, any kind of numeric element, and it becomes sort of unmanageably vast, and essentially what you're talking about is decision making overall, which from a policy perspective isn't terribly helpful, because when you take something sufficiently general, it kind of loses its meaning. What I'll focus on is what is substantively new, and then so why we as a new organisation would engage with that. I would say broadly 2 things are fundamentally new. One is the kind of technology, so the emergence of AI and machine learning in these sectors, and particularly these technologies coming into sectors which historically, frankly, haven't been able to afford them or haven't really understood them, and they're now moving into spaces where we wouldn't have seen them before. And the other is the scale of data. So I deal with quite a lot of areas where the underlying maths and the techniques is not hugely sophisticated and certainly not novel, but the data which is feeding it is profoundly new, and that does present interesting ethical questions. The thing I would say, though, in trying to look at what's new and what's not new is doing this work ends up lifting quite a lot of rocks in terms of what's been done prior to the new approaches, and that's a constant tension in my job. When am I dealing with a new ethical issue, or when am I actually just casting light on something that maybe should have been examined earlier but hasn't been? So really at the heart of this, we're thinking about how we make choices, and in my work particularly how we make choices about individuals' lives. And that is something that in many sectors hasn't really been thoroughly examined before. So there's some blurred lines around that. And then secondly, what do we mean by ethics? It's obviously a pretty challenging phrase, and forgive the slide cliche of the Oxford English Dictionary definition, but I think it's a useful definition because it throws up, for me, what are 2 of the key challenges with what we mean by ethics. So this idea of moral principles that govern a person's behaviour. So the obvious question from moral principles is which moral principles? Lots of people have them, they're not always the same, they're not always congruent. So that really doesn't give us much. I think the other interesting thing is that this describes it as governing a person's behaviour, and obviously my job isn't really about how we govern individual behaviour, it's how we think about where, as a society, we need to set ethical boundaries. And that's a challenging question. It really comes to touch on the limits of state and individual moral responsibility, and that's always fairly fraught. I also get a lot of questions about what the difference between the ethics approach that we promote and legality. So obviously there are already a lot of things you can and can't do in the space of data, in the space of decision making, in the space of discrimination. And I guess the way I would think about this is that when we talk about an individual person that we consider to be ethical, to be considered to be someone who lives by their principles, we probably wouldn't set the bar as that person is simply not a criminal. Not breaking a law is an important first step to operating within a society, but I think the bar for being genuinely ethical, for being genuinely considered about your behaviour and its impacts is significantly higher. And I like this quote by Earl Warren, who's a former Chief Justice in the US, that in civilized life, law floats in a sea of ethics. So of course our laws should be ethical, and of course when something feels so profoundly societally unethical, that is the point where you start to regulate. But beyond law, there is a whole field of where these boundaries are, and it might be comforting if we could regulate and limit for all those questions, but in reality, a lot of this depends on context. A lot of this is pretty subtle stuff, and law isn't always the appropriate tool for that. So, as I said, this brings us to what we define as ethical, and then for an organisation such as mine, once we have defined ethics, at what point and how do we govern for that? Is it law? Is it codes of practice? Is it suggestions? Is it conversations? There's a whole range of ways you can engage in this. And I guess this is more of a personal approach, but for me, ethics is fundamentally about questions. It's about asking questions about what you're doing. It's about reflecting on those answers, and it's about repeatedly asking the questions and continually examining behavior and activity. And one of the things that some people find hugely compelling and love about ethics, and some people absolutely despise about it, is that those questions will almost never have definite answers. It's the process of going through these checks and these analyses. So to warn you, my presentation from here on in is essentially taking you through the range of questions that, when using an algorithm in a real-world example, we feel should be gone through. I've got relatively few answers, and a lot of the questions lead to further questions, but that is in some ways the point that I'm making. So one of the challenges as a new centre we have is already we have people approaching us with descriptions of projects, with descriptions of approaches, and essentially asking us to classify them as ethical or unethical. And that really isn't how it works. It's not a kind of legal, illegal distinction. It's significantly more complex than that. So I'll take you through some of those. So my overarching question is, as I say, what questions should we be asking ourselves about an algorithm? And I guess the kind of starting context of this for me is that, in my view, in most cases, I wouldn't say all, technology and science and knowledge is largely ethically neutral. Again, it's a little bit of a cliche, but you can heat your house with fire or you can burn it down. These tools are how we use them, how we understand them, what we bring to them. So for me, answering these questions will be pretty context is key. Where are you using these tools? What are the existing biases or problems that underlie them? So as I go through these questions, I'll try and draw out how the answers might be profoundly different in different settings and different contexts. And I should say I will have time for questions at the end, but given that I'm taking this very discursive questions-based approach, please do just ask as we go along. I think challenge and discussion is essentially how you do this, so please do. So, very first, it's a very bold question under which lies a lot of challenge. Does an algorithm or approach work? And on some level, you would argue that you would want what you're trying to do to be effective. And of course, to judge whether something is effective or whether something works, you have to understand what for you in this context efficacy means. So in reality, unless the environment that you're operating in is very simple, it will not be a case of something fully working or not working. And certainly if you are making decisions, which most of the algorithms that I work on are making decisions about human individuals and individual behaviors and interventions, humans are messy, humans are difficult. So it won't be a question of an algorithm being 100% accurate, and generally if your algorithm appears to be 100% accurate, that's not a great sign. It's more about thinking about what error rates are tolerable and what kind of error rates are tolerable. So an interesting example for me, which is an algorithm I have some involvement on, is a tool that's being used in Durham to essentially assess whether someone at the point of arrest should go through a traditional criminal justice approach or whether they should go through a softer community-based intervention. It's around risk scoring for reoffence in the criminal justice system. And what's interesting about that algorithm is it asks you to make a decision about how you want to prioritize type 1 and type 2 errors, which they refer to as dangerous errors, meaning when you say someone doesn't have a high risk of reoffending, but in fact they do, and less dangerous errors where someone probably wouldn't reoffend, but you choose to take them through a more, well, not more extreme, a more traditional criminal justice approach. And the proposal in the original research was that you should absolutely minimize, as far as you can, dangerous errors, which feels understandable why someone would go there. You don't really want a situation where an algorithm is routinely putting people who are fundamentally quite dangerous outside of the criminal justice system. However, when you push that up against basic legal principles like innocent until proven guilty, the idea that the algorithm would routinely overestimate people's risk of reoffence comes to be quite troubling, and the context and the consequences for those individuals being put through that feel difficult. So the tolerance of error rate in general, but then also how you balance those error rates, can be a really fraught ethical question. What I like about the HEART tool is they really talked about those issues, that the algorithm allows you to set the ratio how you want. It's really fundamentally an ethical decision outside of the design of the algorithm, how you set that balance. And I think also there's an interesting question about efficacy more generally in terms of accuracy, where it's maybe a less contentious question. So you get some tools, something we get asked a lot about is facial recognition. And you get some examples, so some of the early police examples of facial recognition where they were really getting pretty low accuracy scores. And I guess success is relatively easy to measure in that context. You want the machine to fundamentally identify people accurately. And it was used at the time as a statement that those technologies really weren't great, that they weren't saving police time. And you could make that argument, but also some police officers made the argument that although the error rate was very high and you had to involve humans to check at every level, the triage capacity that the facial recognition technology provided still meant that they were checking far fewer faces. And so that for them, as long as they knew that that error rate was that high, that was still okay. That still made it a practical tool for them. So, you know, there are sort of situations where actually a relatively low level of performance can still be quite helpful. But the facial recognition example takes me on to my final question, that if performance varies, how does it vary? So if something like facial recognition technology generally just has accuracy issues, just generally sometimes it makes mistakes, maybe that's less ethically troubling than what we often see in reality, is that facial recognition technology works much better for some groups than other groups. And that's when you start to see biases in the system. And I will talk about bias in a little more depth later, but error rates are quite rarely evenly distributed. And obviously the consequences of that depend on what you're doing with the algorithm. So you could say that in, say, an airport, using facial recognition technology that works less well for some groups than others is relatively low consequence, because if it doesn't work for you, all you do is you go to a human-run booth. But even that, the experience of being essentially a non-white male in an airport then suddenly becomes much more challenging, and we need to think about what that means for us as a society. Even if all we're really doing is low-level making life harder for certain groups, that's still quite significant, and that's well before you go on to use in things like criminal justice settings, where the questions are obviously significantly more fraught. So I think the question of does something work leads me on to an obvious follow-up question with how does it compare to the status quo. So my main background in this area is in health and health tech, and obviously sort of burnt into how you measure health innovation is not just safety and efficacy, it's also, is it better than what's already available? And I think that's absolutely critical with some of these technologies. So in some of the sectors that I see, there is a kind of glamour around AI and machine learning technology that leads people to want to adopt without necessarily checking that it's what they need. So in some spheres, you absolutely need the most sophisticated, the most cutting edge technology. But in some, actually, the decisions being made are not hugely complex. It's potential that you could get the same benefits by cleaning your data better, by doing some really quite fundamental data curation. And some of the issues around that are pretty practical. Some of the groups I'm working with are things like local government, police forces. They don't have a lot of money, so if they don't genuinely need the technologies and the gains are marginal, for them, they can't justify the spend. But there is also a more ethical question around it, that everything has costs and everything has benefits, and some of the costs around AI, for example, are loss of explainability, which I will talk about a bit more later. So if your benefits in accuracy are marginal, that does affect your decision around these kind of trade-offs. I think what's really fascinating, and goes back to my original point about lifting the rocks and about how this makes us examine other things in more depth, is that to understand how something new relates to the status quo, you actually need to understand the status quo. And I would say what some of these rollouts have revealed is that we don't know how we make choices. We maybe don't know how credit decisions are reached. We don't really know why we hire certain people over certain other people. We might not even know why certain people are arrested and others aren't arrested. And that's a problem for understanding comparative efficacy, but it's also arguably a problem just in general in terms of how we run our society and how we understand how we make decisions. So I think that's a sort of interesting ethical side product of trying to make status quo comparisons. So is the algorithm biased? This is my day job, and I feel like this is not an audience that I need to explain that bias and fairness are terms that have many definitions, and that those definitions don't always sit well with each other, that you can't always optimize for every kind of fairness. Also, bias is not necessarily problematic. In a situation where a recruitment algorithm was biased against people who had a record of underperformance, that doesn't feel like a problematic bias. That feels like the kind of bias that you would want to have, because ultimately we're talking about pattern recognition. So I think that is often a barrier for the more technical audiences that I speak to about bias and fairness, that for them the language feels sort of unacceptably messy. But because I work a lot in public policy and I work a lot in public acceptability, I need to think fundamentally about what the public think and mean by bias and fairness. And although these are complex ideas, I don't think in the public mind they are terribly complex. I think what the public generally means by bias is something that shouldn't influence your decision influencing your decision. So receiving a harsher parole judgment because you're black, being targeted with lower paying job adverts because you're female. Those feel like the kind of biases that the public understand, and really when we come to that, we're talking about fairness. These issues don't come from nowhere, and they certainly don't really, in general, come from the technology. They come from what's underlying in society. And I think to really start to understand bias, especially bias in data sets, you have to understand what's feeding that and what behaviors and what procedures are feeding that. And that's why we have a particular focus on protected characteristics, which are the attributes that are protected against discrimination in law. So those are things like gender, race, religion, sexuality. And the reason those are protected characteristics, the reason that exists, is that there's an understanding that historically systems have worked less well for those groups, and in some and lots of cases not historically to this very day. So when we see these trends in the data, we don't think there must be a collection problem, this must be random. We fundamentally intuitively know that this reflects a broader truth about our society, but then that presents the algorithm design with this huge challenge that really what we're trying to talk about is how you design algorithms well. We're not trying to talk about how you solve racism, but you can't always unpick the two issues, because when you're designing these tools, the last thing you want them to do is kind of promote and ingrain the worst of our society. And in an ideal world, and I believe that they can, what you want to do is kind of challenge these biases. So if you don't understand them and if you don't interrogate them, you can't do that. Where are the biases coming from? We talk about different routes in. So biases in training data is the obvious one. Biases in design, intentional and unintentional. There's also an interesting point around diversity of workforce. So obviously this is not a hugely diverse area in many ways. And there's an interesting question about whether diversity in workforce would genuinely lead to less biased outcomes. In my personal opinion, I think a more diverse AI and tech workforce is a social good in and of itself, regardless of whether it improves design. There's an interesting, I think, relatively untested question of whether more diverse teams give less unfair outcomes. I think it's sort of yet to be analysed. And then this last question, I think is a really interesting one, this idea of what new biases might emerge from the use of AI and machine learning, and particularly when you're feeding it with really large data sets. So protected characteristics are interesting. So obviously they are challenging in that they reflect a history of bias, but what they also bring often is a kind of communal identity that people know that they are members of these groups. They often identify with them. They may advocate for change on their behalf. But what scanning and reflecting on much larger data sets may do is produce groups that people don't even know that they're members of. So it may be that suddenly specific habits become linked to being less creditworthy, or membership of certain groups becomes linked to being less reliable in employment. So you could get to a point where algorithms are making decisions based on things that we might fundamentally consider to be unfair, but aren't things that we are used to watching for in terms of bias. And I think it's probably an under-understood area by us, but it's a really potentially fascinating and potentially quite problematic one, particularly when you move into things like making credit decisions based on social media data as that kind of space. So following on from, is it biased, how is it being used? So algorithms relatively rarely make decisions alone. So they are designed by humans and they're used by humans, and in a lot of the sectors that I'm looking at, they are operated within broader systems. So someone collects the data, someone designs the algorithm, and then someone generally uses it. So someone gives you a credit rating, you sit opposite a mortgage advisor, a police officer decides to stop and search someone. And it is critical to understand these contexts, because bias isn't just from the data and from the use, it's also from how people interact with it. And what's kind of interesting is there's a really emerging psychological reflection on how particularly expert decision makers interact with algorithmic decision making. So there's some concern that you might get something called confirmation bias, whereby people blindly follow risk scores, for example. So if, say, a social worker was making a decision whether a child needed to be taken into care or not, and that child was given a high risk score by an algorithm, they might just follow that and not overrule it in ways that they might with their professional judgment. But there's also a kind of opposite trend that often people making these decisions are very expert. They've been working in it for decades and they don't like the idea of an algorithm telling them what to do. So they may excessively overrule it, and what that can do is reintroduce the kind of good old-fashioned human bias. So this interaction between individual bias, algorithmic bias is critical. So to just assess an algorithm in isolation is not generally that helpful. And so the next one is that explainable is very context specific. So as I say, do we fundamentally understand, and can we make understandable to a lay audience the recommendations that an algorithm is making? And technically speaking, sometimes we can and sometimes we can't, and this question of do we need to? So in some situations, you absolutely need to. So in particular, when you're making decisions around crime and justice. So our system is based on the idea that we explain our judgments around people. People can challenge them, people can appeal. Judges, kind of their meat and drink is explaining their decisions. So if we start to significantly move those decisions into a space where we can't explain, that really presents some quite fundamental challenges about how we view criminal justice. Another space which is sometimes contrasted with that is health. So if you're making decisions around, say, mammogram scans using an algorithm, do you need to understand that? And arguably, if someone prescribes me a drug, I don't really understand the chemical pathways that drug's hitting any more than I would understand an algorithm that was diagnosing me. And maybe that's fine. I think what's not fine is that I trust that my doctor, or at least someone in the space, does understand. So I think when it becomes more uncomfortable is when really there's very limited understanding all along the pathway. So it's not always necessary that the description and the explanation is absolutely lay, as long as there are trusted experts in there. And often, again, talking about these kind of expert decision makers will be very resistant to the use of these tools if they can't be explained to at least their professional satisfaction. And this is when trade-offs start to come in. So often when you go into the really sophisticated technology, you start to lose explainability, and you really need to start thinking about how those tensions emerge and manifest. And then at the end, I guess it's back to my original point that we are considering things that we haven't considered before. So how much do we expect human beings to explain their decisions? So as I say, judges absolutely are expected to explain their decisions. Police officers increasingly so. So historically not so much, and now things like stop and search officers have to explain their decisions, and that's in response to, I think, a general sense that decisions were not being made in the optimum way. But obviously that's quite a challenging area. Human beings can explain their decisions from motives that may not be their true motives. Human beings are also capable of not understanding their own true motives. So it's interesting that we demand a level of explainability from our algorithms that we may be unable to meet in terms of us as human beings. And so as I've already kind of started to touch on this, but what are the trade-offs? We really can't optimize for everything. There are compromises to be had, and some of these compromises are between things like privacy and the ability to use widespread data sets. Some of them are between things like explainability and accuracy. For more on this, I would really recommend a recent report out of the Leverhulme Centre, which is also based in Cambridge, and they did some great work really pulling out some of the kind of key trade-offs in this space. And I talk to a range of sectors, and some sectors have more appetite for these kind of risk and trade-offs than others. As I say, I think policing is one where it's hard to make the case for going into a very unexplainable territory. Finance is more difficult because, you know, that's a space where people in general often don't necessarily understand how their credit rating is reached or their insurance premium is set, and that may or may not be acceptable, but that kind of is the status quo. So there may be more appetite to move into some of the more sophisticated technology there, but you can, and people definitely do, query whether that's the right direction. For me, one of the key questions is being explicit about these trade-offs. So I appreciate it's very different from how your professional experience will be with these technologies, but for the general public, these issues and these questions are sort of still filtered through science fiction, and they are essentially considered to be almost magic. There's really very limited understanding of how these technologies work, and really very limited understanding of the tensions and the compromises that underpin them. So I think having proper conversations about what we gain and what we lose with the public is absolutely vital. This is a question which is not, I don't think is innately an ethical one, but it can become one. Sorry, I've lost the bottom line. It says, is there a difference between public and private sector? basically, sometimes you lose explainability because of technical aspects of the algorithm, and sometimes you lose explainability because someone owns the algorithm and doesn't want to tell you. And those are not the same. And I think we're coming to question how acceptable it is for algorithms to be commercially confidential, in particular in spaces where we would generally expect to be able to explain our decisions. That said, commercial confidentiality is an important spur to innovation, and in general, people still don't have the in-house teams to design these tools. So how do we incentivize investment but not allow an unacceptable level of commercial confidentiality to mar the ethics? And then this question about public sector versus private sector. So I deal with, well, the big areas that I deal with in the private sector are recruitment and finance. The big areas I deal with in the public sector are policing and local government. And you can make the argument that the requirements and the benchmarks are very different, that if something is fundamentally being paid for by taxpayers' money, it feels very uncomfortable for things to be owned separately and for the explanation not to be available publicly. That said, it's not uncontroversial in the private sector either. So I think this ownership question is important. And then my final question is accountability. So when a human being makes a choice about another human being, or indeed about anything really in professional light, you're accountable for your judgment. And obviously an algorithm and a machine can't be held accountable in the same way. Yes, you can hold designers accountable, you can hold the people using them accountable, but there is something about moving decision making away from the human being and what that means for personal responsibility, and particularly what the consequences are for things that when things go wrong. So who holds these risks? And particularly when you get technologies that the people who are operating them and using them may really at a fundamental level not understand. How can a board, for example, take on risk or responsibility for the decision making of an algorithm when they're not computer scientists, they don't understand what they're using? And does that feel like meaningful accountability? And I guess this last one is, where does this leave human autonomy? Where does this leave our moral responsibilities to each other when we're making decisions about each other? And is that something we're prepared to lose or to step away from? If we do that, what does that mean? So you can get quite quickly to quite existential questions on these. So just finally, before I go to questions, I've asked a lot of questions, but I haven't given a lot of answers. What am I actually doing with my time? I am, as I say, running a review specifically into bias in algorithmic decision making, and because of everything I've said about the importance of context, we're focused on 4 specific sectors which we're working with in some depth. The approaches we're taking with these are fairly varied. So financial services, for example, which is a very sophisticated sector in terms of how it uses data and understands data. We're doing some work on technical modeling, technical tools, working with them to analyze existing data. In crime and justice, where these tools are very new, we're thinking about codes of practice for things like police officers, so people who really aren't necessarily used to using data in their day-to-day job, how you make that safe for them. Local government and recruitment, we're working on in the second half of the financial year, so it's still an open question, but suggestions welcome. And I would say that if you are interested in what I've talked about today, it'd be great if you could visit our website. We currently have an open call for evidence for people to send their thoughts in on bias in general, on these sectors in particular, and we are always very open to hearing people's thoughts. That's really my final word. I assume we'll circulate the slides, and please do get in touch with us if you have things to say, because we really want to hear them. So, yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions.
You're addressing a room full of mathematicians. How would you like to bring the questions that you've asked into a form in which the community of mathematicians can help you to answer them?
I think it's the key question. So for a start, I would say there's responsibility to move on both sides. So I think on my side, in kind of policy work, there's still a pretty low level of scientific literacy among politicians, and I would say also among policy professionals like myself. And I think there is a responsibility for us to become more literate in data science. I also think on the side of academic and technical professionals, there is a responsibility to think more about ethical questions. And certainly some of my kind of companion groups in government, so particularly the Office for Artificial Intelligence is thinking about how ethical education can be built more into kind of undergraduate and master's level training. In more specifically in answer to your question, I think that often when I talk to audiences of this kind, a lot of the questions are how we can answer technical mathematical questions, how we can optimize for different kinds of technical fairness, how we can deliver different kinds of analyses of bias. And there's less interest in some of the more, I guess, conceptual questions that I've talked about where those biases come from. I would like to see a broader interest in both sides of those questions. I don't think they're constructively divorced from one another. So I suppose for me it's around a more interdisciplinary approach, because ultimately these are technical tools being used in not terribly technical environments, and we need to be able to talk to each other and work together on them. That would be my response.
May I ask what kind of information you use about algorithm? And is it ethic if the algorithm computes something discriminative for some social group, for example?
So the first question, it would depend on the sector that I was working on. So in some of the sectors, they're basically open source and you can see exactly what they're doing, and in some of the sectors they're very much not, and actually the challenge is to understand even what is going on, particularly in financial services. The banks generally have pretty conservative policies on sharing the details of what they're doing. In terms of discriminating against social groups, I think that's one of the real challenges. So illegal, probably not, because social groupings, so socioeconomics is actually not a protected characteristic under law, which I think is it's an interesting question of itself. But there's this question of disparate impact. So what's not legal is to have, for example, race as an explicit predictor, so to just put race fully into the model. But what isn't technically illegal is to have significant proxies, significant correlations, and have things having disparate impacts at the end. But that's really where you start to have to question ethics. Is the justification good enough? Is the are you happy that your proxies are doing work and that the disparate impact on social groups is a sort of side product? Or are you actually using the proxies in order to identify the social groups? It's really the core challenge in bias, because in general things won't fall evenly on separate groups, and certainly in crime and justice, race really is the fundamental challenge, and you have to start thinking about what your algorithms are showing you. So is it showing you that certain groups do you have more criminal proclivities than others, or is it showing you that the police target certain groups more than others? And so there isn't really a yes-no answer to whether that's ethical or not. So you really have to start digging into what the data is telling you. And I think an academic I was working with recently said to me, which I think is right, that when the data tells you something that makes you uncomfortable, when your results make you uncomfortable, you shouldn't just shy away from that or declare it an unethical algorithm. You should think about where those uncomfortable results are coming from and why that's coming through.
That's right.
So that's a very interesting talk, and I think it's an important topic. A lot of it felt like it was very much about today's algorithms and simple sort of supervised learning algorithms. I just wondered how much you're thinking about future trends, and in particular, networks of interacting algorithms and sort of multi-agent learning approaches and kind of things that we'll see in smart cities and so on.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these questions then become much harder.
I think they do become much harder, absolutely. I think it's a challenge for us strategically as a centre. So I should say we're quite small, and I think we definitely have the ambition to look to the future technologies and where some of these questions become really quite fraught as the technology becomes more sophisticated. But as we've started engaging with the sectors, the current usage of those kind of technologies is often relatively limited, but the ethical questions are still absolutely there. So particularly crime and justice, we kind of went in being like, is it acceptable to use machine learning in crime and justice? And I mean, it's kind of still an open question really, because not many people are. What they're really doing is starting to use data more. And I guess at the moment, we're trying to tackle the issues that we feel are really emerging right now. But I hope that as we grow, we'll have more capacity to do that, because you're absolutely right. It's only going to get more complex.
Given the time, I think we make the ethical decision and head to lunch now, and thank you, Jenny, for talking.